This is hell.
We are no longer in an era of neoliberalism. No, neoliberalism retrenched following the financial collapse of 2007 and 2008. Which it played a significant role in causing. Now, as our guest this morning argues, we are in an era of precarity capitalism that's even worse for society than the neoliberalism that caused the crash. While we might not be in a position to overthrow capitalism, we might be able to overcome capitalism. Here to explain, political and social theorist and educator Albina Asmanova is author of Capitalism on Edge, How Fighting Precarity Can Achieve Radical Change Without Crisis or Utopia. Albina, welcome to This Is Hell.
Thank you, Chuck. Very thrilled to be on This Is Hell.
It's great to have you on the show. You can follow Albina on Twitter at AAZMANOVA. That's A. Asmanova. You write, our times are bereft of great crises, revolutionary upheavals, and utopias. Yet never before have the conditions been so ripe for overcoming capitalism without the help of crisis, revolution, or utopia. Radical progressive change without a revolutionary break is possible, and the time is right for it. Why doesn't it need a revolution? Isn't capitalism's dependence on crises, a dependence that you point out throughout your book, as well as its deep roots in all of society, are all of the world's political and economic processes so deep-seated that the only way of possibly unseating capitalism is something as revolutionary as revolution? And if not revolution, why isn't revolution enough?
Right, very well. Put me on the spot. Let's see. The revolution is not needed, you say, quoting me. Well, I'm saying that it is the peculiarity of our historical time that the revolution is not in the cards. So I'm asking, if this is not very likely to happen, do we have to give up? And I say no, we can find resources for a radical change without the crutch, in fact, of a revolution, without the crutch of crisis, and without the crutch of utopia, even the wonderful socialist utopia. We do not need it in order to go in a different direction, that is the direction against capitalism. Because my main intuition here is that we live in a very strange historical time, which has its special kinks. Look around. Is capitalism in crisis? Hardly. The Western economies, 10 years after the big financial meltdown, are back to solid growth. But many people feel frustrated. They live in hell. There is a renewed interest in socialism, but the idea has lost much of its glory and glamour. It's not so attractive for many. It was discredited, and it was badly discredited by the dictatorships in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So one could argue that the idea of socialism might be useful, but it might be also in the way of radical social change, exactly because it scares so many people away. The prospects for a revolution, as I say, are nil, and yet the chances for a radical transformation are better than ever, indeed, I claim. So these are some of the remarkable contradictions of our times, but they need fresh analysis, unburdened by the convictions, the hopes, and the prejudices of the past. We tend to, imagine the typical discussion about these things. So a chap who defends capitalism and one who defends socialism. How does the typical dialogue go? The body count of socialism, the pro-capitalist raises. And then the socialist says, well, how about the body count of capitalism? And then usually they settle on somewhere a mixture of the two. But what I'm proposing is that we need to go beyond this narrow framework. We are not confined to the choice capitalism versus socialism. So over to you.
You're right that I was personally involved in the short life of autocratic socialism, or the communist regime as it was often called, and helped make it shorter as I became involved with the dissident movements and student strikes that challenged it in my native Bulgaria. But we did not rebel against communism, neither did we hunger after capitalism. Our discontent was imbued with a sense that the everyday reality we inhabited was somehow pathological, as it deviated much too far from the ideals of humanism, fraternity, and decency the system purported to embody. Our requests did not seem radical. They were in line with the blueprint of communism as a fair and free society. Why is government, why are economic systems seemingly incapable of living up to their promises, whether they are the promises of socialism within Bulgaria and the Soviet bloc, or the promises of democracy here within the United States?
Why economic systems incapable of delivering on their promise? I'm not sure that that's always the case. I wouldn't say so, but certainly the autocratic, the dictatorships that called themselves communism or socialism in Eastern Europe, they hijacked the idea of communism and used it for nefarious ends. Capitalism more or less delivers what it promises, and this is prosperity. I'm not saying that's the only way to deliver prosperity, but capitalism does deliver on that prosperity. The problem is that the price that we're paying for that prosperity is way too high. Destruction, basically, of human life, of our communities, and of our nature. Now, the question is whether we are really ready to pay the price for what it takes in the creation of that prosperity.
Do you think capitalists hijacked democracy to any degree?
I love that. That's a very tricky question about democracy. Yes, capitalism has made democracy into one of its mechanisms. The political theorist George Dean is speaking about democracy as a neoliberal fantasy. I also use that approach. If you're looking at contemporary progressive forces, so they say, let's fight populism by more democracy or by fighting inequality, which is another way of fighting for economic democracy through equality. Well, I think that these are the answers, or the wrong answers to the right questions. Simply these answers are past our historical time. So what democracy is helping now achieve within our economic and social system is a very strong capital-labor alliance in support of more growth, more jobs, and redistribution. Now even the likes of Bill Gates are calling for more taxation and redistribution. We hear voices both on the left and the right for redistribution, but in order to have this redistribution, we have to grow the cake so that we can then redistribute it. And we're back to this inflated production and consumption and promises for prosperity for all. But democracy is giving voice to this strong capital-labor alliance in favor of growth and jobs that has been wrecked the environment. And not only the environment, it is wrecking human lives, our everyday existence, because of the price to pay by being all the time in the rat race. So indeed, to answer a quick answer to your terribly uncomfortable question, democracy is hijacked and put to the benefit of capitalism. That is why we cannot count on more democracy to solve the problem.
You write that the current state of capitalist democracy contains a tangible potential for overcoming capitalism by subverting it. Mm-hmm. This is a different path of change compared with stabilizing it, as per calls coming from the political right, overthrowing it, as per appeals by the radical left, or reforming it to make it more humane, the ambition of the center. left. Rather than reforming, stabilizing, or overthrowing, you support subverting capitalist democracy. Why is subverting a better way to challenge capitalism, leading to a better outcome than reforming, stabilizing, or overthrowing?
Okay, indeed. So what my approach to the matter was very well labeled by the political theorist Klaus Soffe as a radical subversive pragmatism. I really like that label. I hope I can live up to it. So what is the difference between subverting it and overthrowing it? Well, before clarifying that, I need to explain how I understand capitalism very briefly. And capitalism is not just about private property of the means of production. It is above everything, above all, social system committed to the production of profit, and preferably to the competitive production of profit. So any practices, any policies that go against the production of profit are radical, in my analysis. And conversely, any policies that might seem very radical in the old understanding of socialism, let's say nationalization of private property, but to the extent that these policies are then committed, are used in the pursuit of profit, let's say in competition with the likes of China and Russia and all kinds of autocratic capitalist countries, they are not radical. They fortify capitalism rather than fight it. So I'm proposing that we go beyond the discussion of how much private property and how much inequality and focus on the real mechanism of capitalism, and this is the competitive production of profit.
So you also mentioned that despite fears and anticipations of the crisis of capitalism, no such crisis has taken place. What are commonly seen as its manifestations, from the rise of populism to the upsurge of precarious employment and slacking of growth, are rather the growing pains in a process of transforming capitalism from the neoliberal model to the precarity form. How is neoliberalism different in its precarity form?
Okay. I see capitalism as having lived through four stages. So we have the 19th century classical entrepreneurial or liberal capitalism. Then we went through the welfare state capitalism after the Second World War. The last 2 decades of the 20th century were marked by the infamous neoliberal capitalism. It had a few features that I discuss in the book, but I believe that around the turn of the century, it was replaced by a new form I describe as precarity capitalism. So while neoliberal capitalism was marked by a state that played a game of hands-off capitalism. So the state lets the market decide many things, but in the precarity capitalism, the state actively interferes in order to help those who already have a competitive advantage in the economy. Because the greatest policy commitment is not to jobs and growth, as during the welfare state. It's not towards a free market capitalism, but towards ensuring the national competitiveness on the globally integrated markets. So because national competitiveness becomes such a priority, then the state starts to handpick specific actors, already those who have an advantage in the global economy, to push them forward. To give them tax breaks, to give them special sweet deals. So it is a new relationship between public authority and the economic actors and businesses, because some are really helped by the state. Another peculiar feature of precarity capitalism, in contrast to the previous forms, is under the neoliberal capitalism of the late 20th century, people are motivated by a thirst for all these opportunities that the global economy of IT and open markets was created. There was a lot of new exciting opportunities, so chasing opportunities, having this sexy capitalism around. Luc Boltanski, the political theory French philosopher, has spoken about this very sexy form of capitalism. In precarity capitalism, or our contemporary form, things are different. People are motivated not so much by chasing exciting opportunities, but by fear. So fear is the widespread motivation for people to stay in the game. And that fear is rooted down to the very basic dynamic of capitalism, the competitive pursuit of profit in the global economy, which has been intensified. And it plays out, this fear creates a precarious existence for people that play out in many forms. So precarity capitalism is a state when it did not give birth to a precarious class, but to a precarious multitude. So people across education, class, and employment are living in a precarious situation. For the young unemployed in Spain, Spain unemployment among the young is above 20%. So their precarity is expressed in the incapacity to get a job, to enter the labor market. On the opposite side are those with well-paid jobs, great jobs, who cannot leave the labor market under these competitive pressures. So they would normally work much less, but out of fear and out of these competitive pressures, fear of losing their income, fear of losing their job, they have to work longer lives and longer working days. So we are all connected through these grievances of precarity, the rich, the poor, the not poorly educated, the well-educated, the winners of capitalism, as well as the losers of capitalism. They're all affected by this generalized precarity. This is my understanding of where we currently stand.
Should then, because as you point out in your book, there seems to be a political focus here in the United States on inequality. Should the focus then be on precarity and not inequality? Are Democrats potentially missing an opportunity to challenge capitalist democracy, to make life better for all of us by not focusing on precarity and instead focusing on inequality?
Indeed, I think we are missing an opportunity because the fight for inequality, as noble it is missing the mark. Let me expand on that. I know it sounds scandalous. So we live in a system where wealth or the improvement of our economic circumstances is based on personal effort. If we are seriously criticizing inequality, that implies that we defend equality. So since Aristotle and many political thinkers and economists, they have made the argument why what Aristotle called arithmetic equality or absolute equality among all is deeply unjust. So unless we have a sense of justifying equality, we cannot plausibly make a big argument about inequality against inequality. But let's leave aside the philosophical argument. There is also a political argument that when we designate the rich as the class enemy, we are precluding the formation of a very broad alliance of forces that have a bone to pick with capitalism. So this anti-capitalist wave currently is so big that strategically we should not preclude it or narrow that alliance by resurrecting the old-fashioned class struggle, especially in its most crude form in the tax the rich narrative.
Okay, so we don't want to have a sole. You write that it's not important. We shouldn't be having a sole focus on class. Why is it important to not have an exclusive focus on class? Because every time I see any discussion on social media about whatever the issue is of the day, somebody always says it all comes back to class. What happens to what do you believe happens to a political worldview when everything is boiled down to, is, if you will, simplified down to nothing but class?
It is the wrong historical time for that battle. Of course, we could have a clash of historical forces around class. That avenue is being opened very actively right now. I simply believe that this is the wrong, not the really radical solution to take, and because we have an opportunity to do more. So, first of all, in our particular historical moment, as I said, there is a very strong alliance of capital and labor against the environment in favor of stabilizing capitalism, in favor of renewed growth and jobs and redistribution. So how to break that alliance and reconfigure these forces into a different direction, this is the big question of our time. How to break the capital-labor alliance in favor of capitalism and subvert it, as I propose, into an anti-capitalist direction. For that, we need everybody who is experiencing the precarity as a problem of their lives to join forces. This is what a class struggle cannot deliver, this very broad alliance of forces that we need in order to subvert the capital-labor alliance in favor of capitalism, to subvert it and turn it against capitalism.
You write what these different versions of the crisis of capitalism obscure in their hasty diagnoses is the transformation of the socio-political order and the emergence of forms of suffering and injustice for which the old lexicon of progressive politics, which saw injustice mainly as a matter of inequalities and exclusion, has no available concepts. Even worse, they ignore the possibility for radical transformation without the crutch of a crisis, revolution, or utopia. Do we not conceive what that radical transformation will look like yet, because we have yet to conceive, we've yet to wrap our minds around and understand the new forms of suffering and injustice that precarity capitalism has introduced?
Right. Yeah, this is a very important thing about looking at what's going on afresh. The trouble is that precarity capitalism nurtures conservative instincts. So because all our existence is so destabilized, people are clinging on to what they already know. Erich Fromm, the German philosopher Erich Fromm, called that fear of freedom. In times of destabilization, we all become more conservative. And the left is affected by that conservative instinct. And I find that recourse to the old language of equality, or fighting the injustice of inequality, and democracy, it is this familiar language through which we confront new experiences of injustice. And those new experiences is what I describe in the book as precarity. Mind you, this word until recently did not exist in the English language. There is precariousness, but probably in the past 5 years it has gained a more mainstream existence. It has been introduced in academic political language. We now speak about precarity. The fact that there is a new term indicates that there is this new phenomenon, and we should not have this conservative instinct to cling on to the familiar terms of inequality, but really recognize that the big troubles of our day have to do with the massive destabilization of everybody's life, and fight that. This is where the momentum for a truly radical politics is contained, because what is causing the precarity is capitalism's very logic, very dynamic, the competitive pursuit of profit. So if we fight that, even if we fight it with very mundane policies, with things like job sharing or universal basic income, these are not very glamorous policies, but because they strike at the competitive production of profit, they would have a radical effect in terms of systems changing effect.
And that's the most dangerous thing about capitalism is its competitive pursuit of profits. We were talking earlier about the idea of inequality and precarity. Is the term inequality in any way a neoliberal term to obfuscate from capitalism's role in causing poverty?
Yes, I would say so. Inequality has become such a broadly accepted remedy for fighting, the great evils of capitalism that we should be suspicious of that. So, of course, imagine a society. Okay, let's imagine a society where all the workers own collectively their factories or the means of production. And everybody is paid the same. It's a completely equal society. And yet it is committed to the competitive pursuit of profit with other countries, with other states. It would still be experiencing the precarity, the exploitation, the alienation that we associate with classical capitalism. So inequality is a form of injustice, but we should not be only fixated on it, because if we are only fixated on inequality and exclusion as the big evils of our time, we fall into something I call the paradox of emancipation. So it is not only that we overlook the big picture or we forget to ask what is it that we want equality and inclusion within. But by asking for inclusion and equality within a certain model, we give additional value to that model, right? We romanticize it. So equality within prosperity, okay, but how about what is the price of that prosperity? Or example in my book I give with women, with the feminists, not only women, but the feminists who fought to include women in the labor market and forgot to note that the rat race is not such a great thing to be equal and to be equal within. So this is the danger of fixating on fighting inequality is this short-sightedness, what I call the paradox, or being trapped in the paradox of emancipation, while fighting one type of injustice to deepen another type of injustice. So this is what I hope the left will find a way to escape.
You write that public authority in this new format of capitalism actively allocates opportunities to individual economic actors by helping them enhance their pre-existing advantage in the global economy. At the same time, it transfers risks to society or to weaker economic actors through a policy approach I named socially irresponsible rule. Stress the logic of policy action that aims at and often achieves economic efficiency, but does so without regard for the impact on society. What happens when the economy of a nation is disconnected from its impact on society? What happens when what's good for the economy is not necessarily good for the vast majority of society?
Yes, exactly. So we are returning to economic growth. So the engine of capitalism is back to its normal functioning, and yet so many of us are feeling exhausted and exploited and living horrible lives. I think it's important to distinguish responsive from responsible rule, because when we are now appealing for more democracy, more radical democracy, democracy is about responsive rule. rule responding to popular demands. That's one thing. Accountable rule is another thing. So whether public authority is accountable to the population or to whatever forces it needs to be accountable to. And socially responsible rule is a different type of political, collective political existence when public authority all the time takes into account the impact on society. There still seems to be persisting this neoliberal consensus that pursuing competitiveness in the global economy is going to deliver well-being for all. But this is coming at the price of more precarious jobs, of longer working lives. So this is the fallout of successfully pursuing competitiveness in the global economy.
Just a couple more questions for you. You write, taxing the rich might not be a bad place to start. As to whether this would amount to saving capitalism or helping dig its grave, the answer is it can do both. Saving capitalism is the particular conjuncture of the early 21st century, is paradoxically a condition for its overcoming. This is the case because rebooting the economic engine of capitalism by stabilizing production, employment, and income also creates the conditions for emancipatory political agency. So, do we need to save capitalism in order to overcome capitalism?
Yes, that's a beautiful paradox of our times. Indeed, see, this destabilization, the massive precariousness, is nurturing conservative, even reactionary instincts. I mean, the outright. Also, look during the biggest economic crisis, the populations re-elected the center-right leadership that got them into this crisis. So in order to fight these conservative instincts, we need to stabilize. We need anti-precarity policies. Some of that consists in redistribution, but most importantly in stable working contracts, in disconnecting the income of people from their employment status. So indeed, paradoxically, we need to stabilize capitalism in order to create the conditions for this unleashing of political imagination. An example would be the 68 and the 89 revolutions. As the author of the Port Huron statement of Students for Democratic Society of 68 wrote, we, at the beginning of the statement, we all, I'm quoting by memory, we all lived in relative affluence. Well, it is not so much the richness, but the economic stability that allows people to think big politically. That is why I do not think that economic crisis, against much of what the Orthodox left would claim, economic crisis is not the condition for political revolution. It is economic stability that, in my analysis, is the precondition for thinking big politically, for venturing. The same happened with our revolution of 89, in which I was a participant. We all live in relative affluence, in fact, at least in relative economic stability, and then we could venture in the search for a different political and social system. So yes, we need to stabilize capitalism in order to create the economic conditions for its political overcoming.
One last question for you. We've been speaking with Albena Asmanova. She is a political and social theorist and educator and author of Capitalism on Edge, How Fighting Precarity Can Achieve Radical Change Without Crisis or Utopia. You can follow Albena on Twitter at @Asmanova. One last question for you, Albena, and it's what we call the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience might hate your response. Why, if we fixed capitalism, why, if we fixed that system, why would we want to overcome a system that we just fixed? Mm-hmm. Why would we want to save ourselves from a system that we just fixed?
Oh, wonderful. Okay, I'm saying that we need to fix capitalism as an engine of prosperity in order to overcome capitalism as a way of life, as a social life. Because what is costing people, and to reboot the engine of prosperity now, is lives that they no longer value. Now, Joseph Schumpeter, he wasn't a great adept, the Austrian economist who was also a professor of economics at Harvard. He was an adept of capitalism, and yet he observed that, the educated classes which have the biggest political impact are learning to endorse a life that the economic effort at the pursuit of profit is not actually delivering. It is counter. It goes against that life that people value. So it seems to me that in our time, people have come to hate the effort that is necessary to land them into the prosperous life that they're hankering after. So I'm counting on this contradiction between the economic engine of prosperity and what it takes to fuel it versus the lives that it is giving people in the course of pursuing that profit.
Albina, I really appreciate you being on the show today. This is a fascinating book. I'm very honored to have you as our first guest in 2020. Thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you, Chuck. It's a pleasure.
Take care.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.